I'd like to introduce to you Lauriane Chalmin-Pui. Lauriane is an independent expert on the influence of gardens and gardening on human health and well-being. Lauriane was a postdoc wellbeing fellow at the Royal Horticultural Society and the University of Sheffield Department of Landscape Architecture, another connection with Sheffield. Lauriane holds a BA in Geography from the University of Cambridge, an MSc in Environmental Policy and Regulation from the London School of Economics and Political Science, and a PhD in Landscape Architecture from the University of Sheffield that you've heard a lot about already. During Lauriane's doctorate, she was also a visiting scholar to the Centre for Design and Health at the University of Virginia School of Architecture. Lauriane is going to present to you today some work that was done at the University of Sheffield that has been submitted for publication in the Cities and Health Special Journal. The authors weren't able to come, and Lauriane has kindly agreed to give you some of that, as well as contexting it in the broader scope of other research in which she's been involved. Please welcome Lauriane.
Hi everyone, I'm back. This is the title of Simone's presentation. So I'm presenting on behalf of Simone Farias, Lauriane Chan, Nicola Dempsey, Kirsten McEwen, Helen Hoyle, and Ross Cameron. They are all at the University of Sheffield Landscape Architecture Department, apart from Kirsten, who's at the University of Derby. Simone and Ross, they all send their regards, but unfortunately they can't be here with us today. Any errors or omissions or confusions or whatever, they're all entirely my responsibility. I'll try to be as clear as I can, but if you do have a specific question, I have their manuscript so we can check together and we can figure it out. But essentially, Simone submitted this paper to the special issue, which is part of his wider PhD thesis, which he actually just submitted last week, so congratulations, Simone. Hopefully I'll do this some justice. Just a quick point of clarification before you start imagining completely different things. This is not about virtual reality. So we have, ironically, just discussed about the importance of specific places and the connections to people and all of that. We're now moving into the realm of imaginary places. I'll give you a feel for what this virtual part is, but we're not replacing places. It's just a way of conducting a scientific experiment in which you can control for all the confounding variables like weather, other people, sound, smells, etc. This is really not trying to be sort of extremely futuristic and no, we don't need places anymore. Yes, we need places. This is just a means to understand how places work. So the central question is in the title: does real or perceived biodiversity elicit restorative responses in a virtual park? I'll just flash back this particular slide of mine from yesterday just to situate us. We have talked plenty more about the different mechanisms through which green spaces impact our health and stress restoration. None of these pathways that I've mentioned actually explicitly talk about biodiversity, but I think even today we've talked about it quite a lot. For example, how the different trees capture different particulate matter, the different connections to places. There's so many ways in which all of these pathways actually will be influenced by biodiversity. And I guess when we're talking about green spaces, there's a default assumption that there is some life, but it's a question of what is the role of that biodiversity and how does it contribute to either different health outcomes for different people, etc. So in the scope of this paper, they define biodiversity as essentially a quality of green space. So it is, they've defined it as the variety of plants and animals in a green space, and so therefore it's a quality. So we can say that a lawn like this is a green space that has very low biodiversity. It's a monoculture, basically. We've talked about that already. And compared to this green space, which we would characterize as having high biodiversity. They are also talking about macro biodiversity, actually, so talking about plants and mammals, rather than going specifically into insects, which because of different sort of relationships to insects that different people might have, I'd say that that kind of adds even more nuance. So it's really, this experiment is trying to be as controlled as possible. Of course, all of this is in the context, I'm sure you know, about sort of global and many local biodiversity crises around the world that are ushered in by climate change, our exploitation of natural resources and habitat loss, of course. And so cities and their green infrastructure have become sometimes unexpected sanctuaries for many plant and bird species, which is what we're focusing on. And with appropriate management, as we've seen several examples already, cities can be turned into actually really favourable habitats for biodiversity. Early studies did hypothesize that there was a quite simple relationship between biodiversity and mental well-being, quite a linear one. So the higher biodiversity you have, the higher mental well-being you might get from that space. But further studies found sometimes no statistically significant differences between these two spaces. Sometimes it was non-linear, so if you had a certain degree of biodiversity, that was sort of optimal, but at some point maybe there was too much biodiversity, where there was sort of diminishing returns, or maybe then if we're looking, are there like loads of teeming insects and snakes and all of that, is that just too much biodiversity for us to enjoy? So this is getting quite murky, I suppose. Ross Cameron's, this is one of Ross Cameron's earliest studies in this kind of area on how people would feel. I think this is a similar phone app to the one Frankie mentioned, but yes? Okay, yeah, so it's the Schnapp app as well that they used for this particular study that was looking at pleasant emotional responses that they call positive affect to their experiences in different Sheffield city parks. And they found a positive correlation with positive affect and the bird biodiversity. So this is avian biodiversity. So they found more birds in the Graves Park, for example, which had higher positive affect than in the Peace Gardens, which actually isn't really much of a garden, it's quite a sort of concreted plaza. So this was an observational study. So it was people going to these parks and then they reported how they felt. A subsample of these parks, sorry, I don't know exactly which ones, but they found that the effect was actually strengthened if people thought that bird biodiversity was high, as opposed to it actually was high. So this started raising some questions, and this was all going at the same time. So in the Sheffield sort of research group, other things that were going on, which I'm glad many of you have actually touched upon today, because this is not my area of expertise. But there's all sorts of environmental regulation and ecosystem services around different kinds of vegetation and the volatile organic compounds that they either emit or remove, particulate matter, pollution, etc., even sound pollution, so kind of being a sound barrier mainly to traffic noise and things that we don't really like. So this was going on, and also studies on human thermal comfort, as has already mentioned, and how important the biodiversity of those trees were. So just having the same trees all the time, less helpful. And then this is, again, some quite advanced studies on phytoncides, and this is the volatile organic compounds that trees emit. It's basically a mode of communication for them. But having different diversity of trees would lead to different diversity of phytoncides in the air, which has all sorts of positive impacts on our immune system function. A lot of these studies come from Japan and Korea. And this is some more very advanced stuff from Jake Robinson, who was studying the microbiome of the microorganisms that are sort of living in the clouds, not in clouds, but like in air. He found that they sort of live at similar kind of, I'll call it altitudes, but we're just talking meters high, of the different trees and shrubs. So if you have got different structures of trees and different heights and different species of trees, there will be different microorganisms in the air, and a higher diversity of microorganisms is also a good thing. So all this is going on. Ross starts asking all these different questions, and then Simone comes in to do his PhD, and he's really in tune of how the mental health and the positive affect side of things, so all the sort of aspects about emotions and stress recovery, etc., that we've already covered quite well. And he starts getting really interested in the perceptions of biodiversity. Liwen, who's the second author of this article, she's also doing her PhD at the same time. Sorry, you're getting the whole chronology of it, because this is how I lived it. So they together started looking at perceptions of biodiversity as a construct, which essentially, they said, involves both the sensory information that we may see, or hear, or smell, etc., so, and also a subjective experience. So if we see lots of flowers that are a different colour, the basic assumption is that is a different flower. That's our number one visual signal that those two flowers are probably different. Although we don't necessarily know that, they're just a different colour, or they just have a different smell, etc. If you are in a park and you hear or don't hear birdsong, you will make assumptions that there are birds, even though you don't necessarily see them. And if you hear different pitches of birdsong, you'll probably think like, oh, there's more biodiversity here. So there's a lot of things going on if you see different leaf structures, etc. This is also, I think Christine mentioned it, linked very much to education. Like, what do we even know is biodiversity? It is obviously a scientific concept, but I think also you don't have to be like educated in biology if you see a photograph of a rainforest, even though you don't hear all the sounds of the teeming rainforest, you will assume that there's more biodiversity in that rainforest, and that the image you're seeing is more biodiverse. So there's so many different things going on when we sort of first engage with the space without even necessarily being familiar with it. Super complex. And the other thing that we know is that actually public perceptions of biodiversity tend to be really poorly related to actual measurement biodiversity. This is an article from a different article, not the special issue, that Liwen was the first author for, and she was looking at flower colour, and she found that these, which calls hot, which are basically these bright, saturated, deep red kind of colours, provided positive affect and stimulation. This is very similar to what I was saying yesterday. In fact, I probably integrated some of her stuff into my work. What she found also is that the effect was not diminished by adding, so here you can see that there are some like blues and purples and what we might call cooler colours. That effect of positive stimulation, positive uplift, wasn't detrimental, but then the sort of cooler, paler, more muted colours, they had a more relaxing effect, and that was actually diminished if you added sort of like bright orange or something. So that's quite interesting, and linked to the diversity of flowers. So this brings me now to the research questions of the present paper. So I'll just read them out, I guess. Does higher park biodiversity improve well-being more than lower, but not no biodiversity? Does perceived biodiversity elicit more well-being than actual biodiversity? Does noticing individual elements of biodiversity elicit well-being? And is there any difference between non-stressed and stressed participants? I think that's all quite clear. The last one is very interesting. So as I said, this is a controlled experiment. And one thing they did try to do that they controlled for is that one group of people were actually confronted with a stressor during the experimentation period. It was a really loud fire alarm when they were not expecting it. And then the other group were not stressed, they were just left to do the thing. So it's a really neat study. So Simone is a computer whiz, and he created these virtual environments himself. This was sort of a first study that he did that was in a woodland. So he actually took 360-degree videos and then rendered them to make them look neat. And he compared different levels of plant biodiversity on stress recovery. This also included a fire alarm. And he essentially found, so the 4 different colored bars are basically 4 different species. So the green line, which is the highest, is high biodiversity. And then the blue line, which is kind of covered by the orange one, is the control, and then red is low biodiversity. And he found that so all levels of biodiversity had a similar effect on stress recovery, so following the fire alarm. However, perceived biodiversity, which there was a question in the questionnaire that asked them how much biodiversity did you think that was in this video? That was associated with a higher stress recovery after the fire alarm. So basically the controls of what people were actually seeing had no impact or no statistically significant difference. I mean, it was helpful, it didn't lead them to remaining stressed, but they recovered, I don't think it was a time, so it wasn't quicker, but they recovered more following a video where they thought there was a higher biodiversity. And then he made a virtual park. And this is where the experimental part comes in. On your apps, Nix has actually put a link so you can experience the virtual park. It's basically like Street View, in case you're not able to get to it. But yeah, feel free to go on. I think it's under like the session now, and then there's links that says high biodiversity and low biodiversity, so you can have a wander. I think there should be a screen. Okay, cool, thank you. So these are also the QR codes, and so that side is high biodiversity, and this side is low biodiversity. What's interesting, actually, so he sent me the link of 2, but I've just reread it very carefully, and they were actually 4 different conditions. And because of Liwan's study earlier, there's one that was high biodiversity with high color diversity as well, one that was high biodiversity with low color diversity, and then the same for low biodiversity. So you can have actual biodiversity be higher than flower color diversity, if that makes any sense at all. Yeah, okay. So this is what participants were being shown. They had headphones on. They were told it was to just block out any exterior noise, but actually it was because for half of them, they were going to hear a fire alarm in the headphones. So they could wander around. I think they had sort of 10-15 minutes to do it. And yeah, this is what I was explaining. So, and then they actually, because of the cultural implications as well, they managed to tap into a whole network and get lots of Chinese-speaking participants to do this study as well. So there are 4 replications. It's a very well-controlled experiment, is what I'm saying. And altogether, this was with 1,600 people. So quite a lot of people who went through this experiment. And then, again, what's amazing is only the perceived biodiversity was associated with well-being. The trends for both language groups rather, were basically the same, similar, but sorry, other clarification I should have said. We've just shown you low and high biodiversity. There was another one for medium biodiversity, which was kind of that middle ground that they were testing. And so for the English-speaking group, it was a perceived perception of medium biodiversity that was the most sort of restorative. But for the Chinese-speaking group, it was the perceived high biodiversity that was more restorative. And so, yeah, I guess this also points to the fact, really, that it's about noticing the biodiversity. Again, it speaks to everything you've just said about connection, about understanding, about education, etc. Of course, in these virtual park sort of scenarios, it's not about insects, it's not about all the other levels of biodiversity that we know exist. It's about the really kind of like obvious ones, like there's some rabbits hopping around and things like that. So that's really something that I think a lot of us would take for granted. I know some people will call this sort of like plant blindness, things like that. So you just kind of see vague blocks of green, which is often what like all the green stuff will appear in like the big urban planning architectural plans are just green as opposed to actual detail. Yeah, perceptions of biodiversity overestimated the actual number of species, so we can probably work with that. And then, yeah, this kind of raises remaining questions for the rest of the group and probably for many of us in the room. Who does gardening work for? Who does it not work for? How can we improve access, but how can we improve that kind of understanding and connection? Is it that we need more facilitation? Do we need kind of a signpost? I think, was it Christine who mentioned, like, oh, I'm not lazy, I'm just doing this for biodiversity. But maybe it's like, okay, then I'm also actually saying what biodiversity that is. Like, this is a bee, this is the function of the bee, this is how it contributes to society, etc. Ensuring, obviously, that biodiversity is respected and valued in its own right, not just for us humans, but having that really kind of symbiosis and acknowledging that we do sort of live together. And yeah, that's it. Thank you very much.
Lauriane, thank you very much for that. I find it really fascinating to learn how the research that you're doing and the different projects around Sheffield are intersecting. And I find it really interesting that through the speakers that we've had today, how much the work that each of us is doing in our individual topic has connected. So I do hope your research can continue in this section. Thank you very much indeed.